Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Pastor on the Porch. My name is Stuart Milton, and I'm here with Snarky Amy.
I have a new name.
You do have a new name. We are concluding our very quick look at Matthew's Gospel this week. Next week, we will actually begin Mark's Gospel. You know, when life gets stressful and uncertain, and it seems like there are no right answers, I think the only thing we can do is run to Jesus. Always run to the arms of Jesus. And one of my favorite passages comes from Hebrews, where the author says, "And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith." Well, we pick up the Jesus story this week in Matthew chapter 22. It is truly the heart of the matter. I'm not able to speak about every incident, remember, but I'm going to try to focus on some of the stories that spoke to me. In chapter 22, Jesus is approached by a group of Sadducees who didn't believe in the resurrection. They pose a most interesting question to Jesus about a woman whose husband dies before they could have children. Then, following tradition, she marries all his brothers. There were 7 of them. I hope you like your brothers-in-law. All right? Anyway.
I'm glad that's not still a tradition.
Well, hopefully I was going to say, hopefully you don't have to worry about the first part of that either. So.
No.
Well, they do try to trick Jesus by asking him who the woman will be married to in heaven. Well, Jesus corrects them very clearly, telling them that God is the God of the living. My friends, God is the God of the living, not the God of the dead. God is the God of the here and the now. When life gets perplexing and trials come, this is always a reminder that God is present here and now, and Jesus is risen from the dead. Resurrection is at the heart of our faith. Well, maybe a little bit more on that in just a few minutes. But the next story is also part of what the heart of the matter. And, you know, sometimes it's just best to read it straight from the Scripture. We read, "Teacher, which is the most important commandment in the law of Moses?" Jesus replied, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these 2 commandments. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself." The heart of the matter. You know, we can make faith so complicated. But then we read these words of Jesus. Love God, love neighbor. Of course, yes, it is a little bit more than that. But when in doubt, we love God, we love others. You see, Jesus is risen, and that is our call. Our call is to love God and others. Well, moving on, in chapters 23 to 25, we read more about the last week of Jesus' earthly life. All of those teachings come in his final days, and then they're given while he is in Jerusalem. In chapter 23, Jesus again has some very harsh words for the religious leaders. Jesus says the religious leaders are so caught up in the outward focus of the law, doing what the law requires, but have forgotten that it is of the heart. People are more important than laws. Jesus' condemnation of the religious is that they have failed to take the message to the heart and are performing their religion outwardly, but their hearts are far from God. I think it was last week that I said these types of verses really perk up my ears. I especially read them again when there are tough issues. I know I will be judged by the risen one more harshly than others because I am a religious leader. And I don't want to be a Pharisee or a Sadducee. I want to be one who follows Jesus, has the attitude of Jesus, and treats others like they were Jesus. And friends, that's not always easy. Most of the time, at least a lot of the times, I fail. But that is the goal for all of us who are seeking to follow Jesus. Well, chapter 24 is a discourse about the future. Part of the chapter is a prophecy about what will happen to Jerusalem. And this prophecy comes to fulfillment in AD 70 when the Romans destroyed the city. Another part of that chapter is a prophecy reminding us that Jesus will return to earth. When Jesus returns, we will see him just as he is. He will come to judge the living and the dead. And Jesus says we must be ready. We must be on constant watch. We do not know when the Lord will return, but he will return. Will he find us focused on the most important things? Or will he find us focused on things that perhaps the world is just thrusting upon us? Jesus is coming. Are you ready? Chapter 25 reminds us that judgment will come, and tells us, when you do it to the least, you do it to me. Who are the least? Jesus has a list. The hungry, the poor, the prisoners, the sick. Perhaps we would add others, but he ends it by saying, when you do it to the least, you do it to me. We conclude Matthew's gospel again with the heart of the story. The last week, the last 24 hours, and beyond. You know these stories, but I brought some things with me that helped remind me. After I unwrapped them from my 60th birthday, from my staff being able to, or choosing to wrap most of my things in the office.
Well, 60 of them. There may be some behind me still wrapped.
There are a couple of things that are still wrapped. This is a plate and chalice. Special to me because my father made them, and he passed on a couple of years ago. And it reminds me that Jesus had a last meal with his disciples. It was a Passover meal, and they were all together. But he changed it a little bit. And he took a piece of bread. And he said, "Take, eat. This is my body, which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And after the supper, he again gave thanks. He gave it to his disciples and said, "Take and drink from this, all of you. This is my blood of the new covenant for you and for all. Do this in remembrance of me." That's why we come to the table, to remember.
Tell you, I had a youth a few years ago. Well, it's many years ago now. And we went on a youth trip. He came with a friend. Didn't normally go to church. And we went up to the front to take communion, and we did it by intinction, so he dips the bread in the cup, and he comes back, and he leans up to me, and he says, "That was really good. Can I get more of that, Jesus?" I was like, mark that in stone. That was a good... I said,
Absolutely.
yes, you can in many ways, but it was... I know he was talking about the taste, but I hope he got more than that along the way.
Absolutely. It is in communion that we experience God's grace. Following the meal, they sang a hymn, and they went out to the Mount of Olives. And Jesus went away, and he knelt down, and he prayed. He prayed a prayer that I try to always be praying. "Father, take this cup from me if it is possible, but not my will, but your will be done." He prayed it not once, but 3 times. And may that still be our prayer, to always say that whatever is going on in our life, not my will, but your will be done. While he was praying, Judas arrived and with a group of soldiers and betrayed him with a kiss. Shortly thereafter, as the religious leaders were trying Jesus, asking him questions, Peter was trying to listen in, and Peter denies knowing Jesus. Again, not once, but 3 times. It leads me to always ask myself, is my attitude, my actions, are they denying Jesus? Are they showing others that I've accepted him and that I know him? Of course, there's a series of trials that we will read about this week. Both the religious and political leaders acted, and to have Jesus condemned to death on a cross. Of course, then there's the crucifixion. This was given to me a few years ago by a good friend who made it for me. And it reminds me that Jesus went through the streets of Jerusalem. Technically, a little bit historically inaccurate because he probably wasn't carrying the whole cross, but just the crossbeam. But he carried a cross. And he carried it for you, and he carried it for me. When they got to Golgotha, also known as Calvary, they nailed him to the cross. And I keep 3 nails in my office, because they would have nailed into his wrist, into another wrist, and at least one into his feet. And there he would have hung. He would have hung for hours. While hanging there, lots of things happened. He spoke with people. He talked with people. And I'm not sure this is in Matthew's gospel off the top of my head, but he also said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." You know, when I get hurt, when things are said and done that hurt me, I remember that. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them." That means I have to as well. Well, Jesus was laid in the empty tomb, and there he stayed for 3 days. But in the last chapter of Matthew, what we hear and what we are reminded of is that the women went to the tomb, and there was a stone that had been rolled over, and Jesus wasn't in that tomb. The cross was empty. The tomb was empty because Jesus is risen from the dead. That is the heart. The crucifixion and the resurrection are the heart of the gospel of Jesus. That's what it comes down to. That Jesus died on the cross for your sin and for my sin, and 3 days later he was raised again. Paul says that is what is most important. Read 1 Corinthians 15 as well. Jesus is risen. He is risen indeed. Well, Matthew's gospel ends with what we know of as the Great Commission. He was with the disciples, and he reminds them that he had all authority, that all authority had been given to him. We've seen that throughout Matthew's gospel, the authority of Jesus, and he still has it. And he tells us to go into the world, make disciples, teach and baptize, and he reminds them that he is with them. And that hasn't changed. Jesus is risen from the dead, and he has all authority. He will come again to judge the living and the dead, and we're called to be on watch. And part of that responsibility is to make disciples. So I want to finish this week's reading in the Gospel of Matthew with a challenge. I want you to remember that our call is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. You know, sometimes we forget that. Sometimes I forget that. Sometimes we get so busy doing other things that we just don't do it. But our responsibility is to invite others to journey with us, with Jesus. Our responsibility is to seek to invite others to follow Jesus, the Jesus in whom we believe. So that's where we're going to end this week's video, with the resurrection of Jesus and our call to make disciples. That is also where new life begins. Sometimes there are things we don't understand. Sometimes we don't know exactly what our next steps are. But when we focus upon Jesus, the reality of His death and His resurrection, we know that is what will be at the heart of the matter. My brothers and my sisters, remember, Jesus is risen. And let us go and make disciples. See you next week as we begin the Gospel of Mark.